everyone, and welcome. Good morning if you are in Pacific time like we are, or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are in the world. We're so excited you could join us today for a conversation with Sharon Blackie on mythology, land, and life. My name is Alex Elliott. I'm the Senior Manager of Events and Engagement for the Public Programs Department of California Institute of Integral Studies, which, if you don't know, is a nonprofit university located in San Francisco. As many of us are descendants of settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcefully brought to this continent, we, CIIS public programs, must recognize and never forget that our university's building in San Francisco occupies traditional, unceded Ramaytush Ohlone lands. If you're interested in learning more about native lands, languages, and territories where you are, we encourage you to visit native-land.ca. Before we get started today, I have just a couple of general tips and some troubleshooting items to go over. We are going to be having a live Q&A for anyone who is watching this live stream live. You could submit your questions at any time using our web form, which is linked in the event description just below this video. Our presenters are going to select questions that were submitted via that form after their talk, and then we'll try to get through as many as we have time for today. We do have automatically generated captions for this event. You can toggle those on and off using that closed captioning button right in YouTube. Chat is enabled for this event, but please note that it's not being moderated and our presenters cannot see that chat. Chat is not required to fully experience this event. If you do choose to participate, we ask that you be respectful and avoid language that could be offensive or insensitive to others. You can turn that chat off at any time, and we encourage you to do so if you find that it's negatively impacting your experience in any way. If you are having any issues with your audio or video, we always suggest that you start by refreshing the page. And then if you're still having issues, you can adjust your audio and video settings right within YouTube. Now let me first introduce our presenters, Dr. Sharon Blackie and Dr. Rachael Vaughan, and then we will get right to their conversation. Dr. Vaughan is a member of the core faculty here at CIIS. She teaches in the Integral Psychology Department, as well as in ecology, spirituality, and religion. Her current research centers around the problem of how to live decently in the Anthropocene and the profound change of consciousness that is needed to face our current crisis. Her deep and lifelong love of the land has led her to studies in contemporary animism and mythopoetics, and she has long been inspired by the work of Sharon Blackie. Dr. Sharon Blackie is an award-winning writer, psychologist, and mythologist. Her highly acclaimed books, courses, lectures, and workshops are focused on the development of the mythic imagination and on the relevance of myth, fairy tales, and folk traditions to the personal, cultural, and environmental problems we face today. As well as writing 5 books of fiction and nonfiction, including the best-selling If Women Rose Rooted, her writing has appeared in anthologies, collections, and in several international media outlets. Sharon is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and has taught and lectured at several academic institutions, Jungian organizations, retreat centers, and cultural festivals around the world. And now it is my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Blackie and Dr. Vaughan.
Hello, Sharon. It's delightful to see you over there in Britain.
Hi, Rachel. Lovely to see you too.
So, Sharon, you're a psychologist, a mythologist, a feminist, and you write about the crossover of women, myth, and land. And I'm wondering if you could start by explaining how those areas come together for you and why they're important.
Well, they began to come together for me, I suppose, when a couple of decades ago, in the midst of about my 3rd midlife crisis, I began to research my own native mythical traditions to find out really what they said about women, because, you know, the religion that I had grown up in, Christianity, was very patriarchal, and I couldn't seem to find a place for women in it. And as part of that midlife crisis, I was trying to figure out what it was to be a woman anymore in this world. And I felt that I needed to go back to my own native traditions of Britain and Ireland to find that out, and found that particularly in the Irish tradition, women were presented, divine women particularly, were presented as, in a sense, the embodied land. They were immanent in the land. They represented the land and the spirit of the land and the other world that was entangled with it. So all of these myths showed women as kind of guardians and protectors of the land. And that really resonated with me in my early 40s, seeing it as something that was incredibly important in a world where we are facing so many environmental and ecological catastrophes. It gave me a kind of anchor point for what a woman might be able to be. So ever since then, I've seen kind of women, the land, or ecology and mythology is all very much tied up together in the traditions of this part of Europe. And the reason why I think they are important is that they, again, they give us an anchor for how our ancestors used to see women's place in the world, and they kind of teach us what it's possible for us to become, I think.
That's very interesting. So you're talking about the ways of being a woman that have happened through time, but essentially in the British Isles, drawing on the mythic traditions of the British Isles. I wonder if you'd clarify what woman means in this context, because that definition is shifting in our own time. So who does the term woman include for you?
Well, back in the old days, when these myths, particularly when the myths were written down, I guess they were pretty essentialist, so they would have been, as far as we can tell anyway, they would have been talking about biological women at the time. Now, I don't think, to be honest, I don't think it really matters. I mean, I think that these myths and these ways of representing what we might call feminine qualities, if you like, are as relevant to anybody. So they're relevant to biological women, they're relevant to trans women, they're relevant to anybody who identifies as a woman. I think the things that they are teaching us about how we can be in the world generally, are open to everybody. I don't see myth as exclusive. I don't see our myths, for example, as being race focused, even though they clearly were from a time in the British Isles where there probably would have been in an island where there probably would have been predominantly white people. If the myths come from the land and they speak about the relationship between women and the land, then they're relevant to anybody who is on this land. Myths are not in the business of excluding. So to me, they're open to everybody to take what they need from them.
Beautiful. So we're going to use a whole bunch of Jungian terminology, I would think, and you've already mentioned some terms. Let's clarify a little bit just for people who haven't read all of your books and all the supporting material. First of all, can you explain a little about archetypes? What are archetypes and why are they important to modern life?
Well, the word archetype was coined predominantly by Carl Jung, but he didn't originate the idea. The idea originated really all the way back in ancient Greece from Plato, and Plato didn't use the word archetype. He used the word ideas or forms. And to Plato, these were kind of essential ideas or characters or things, if I can put it that way, that couldn't be reduced anymore. So just to give you an example, sometimes it's easier to see it in terms of ideas. To Plato, beauty was an idea or an archetype. And the reason for that is that we all know what it is. Now, we might have a different vision of what beauty might look like, but we all understand if somebody says, oh, that's beautiful, we know what they mean, even if we don't agree personally that that's beautiful. So these, to Jung, if we move on to Jung, these were kind of essential aspects, particularly of the human psyche, kind of like they were bits of the structure of the human psyche. They were all of the kind of experiences that we could have, the things that we could become. And because of that, because they are seen as the fundamental aspects of the human psyche, then clearly they're fundamentally important. So we have an archetype, for example, if I can give you a kind of more Jungian example, Plato for beauty, Jung. Let's take the wise old woman archetype. We all know, if you say the word wise old woman, we all know what that means, but it looks different in different cultures. So in Scotland and Ireland, the Kalia is the wise old woman. She's the old woman in that native tradition who created and shaped the land. For some American peoples, it might be Grandmother Spider. For in the Slavic traditions, it could be Baba Yaga. But they're all elements or aspects of this wise old woman archetype. And again, I think the different clothes that archetypes wear in different cultures gives us an idea of what we might become at various stages in our lives.
You mentioned the Kalia. Actually, I first met you when I took your course many years ago for Celtic women rediscovering their roots, which is where I read about the Kalia. Would you like to say a little bit more about her? She's such an important figure,
Yeah,
particularly in your latest book.
Yeah, I would always love to say more about the Kalia. She is very much a character in the Gaelic tradition, so Scotland and Ireland, and to a lesser extent the Isle of Man. And in these old traditions of these islands, we do not have any myths that tell us about the creation of the universe, but we do have these wonderful set of myths and folklore that tell us about this old woman who created and shaped the land. And she is presented as this gigantic, rocky figure who is the oldest of the old. So she says in some of the stories about her, when I was a young lass, the ocean was a forest full of trees. So she has lived through all these geological ages. And she is also presented in many stories as a very, very fierce guardian and protector of the wild things and of the natural world. So again, when I discovered these old stories, and there are many, many old stories about her, in Scotland and Ireland, there are so many place names named after the Kalia. So she's very much a living figure. She's not some dusty old relic. But I thought that this was such an inspiring figure that in our lineage, there is this old woman who kind of stands firm and endures all of the ravages of time and tries to stop humans from taking too much from the land.
I think your answer is already touching on my next question, which is what's important about myth? What's important about us knowing these old stories, and why do they matter?
Well, we are storytelling animals. I mean, it sounds a bit cliche to say that, but as a psychologist and back in the day a neuroscientist, our brains are structured to recognize narrative. And humans have clearly told stories ever since the beginning of time and passed them down through the centuries and the millennia. And as kids, one of the first things we do is to start to make up stories about toys or friends or imaginary friends or whatever. So it's kind of built into us. Now, myths and fairy tales are a little bit different in what they do. So myths generally have an explanatory quality. So they're important because they tell us something about the nature of the world we live in, or the way that our culture sees the world we live in, which is a whole different question, and the part that we can play in it. So they kind of tell us how things come to be, where the moral compasses are, and so on. And of course, that's an important thing. We are living today by myths, whether we recognize it or not, because our culture tells us a story about who we can be in the world, and what restrictions we face. Fairy tales are important. Arguably, I would hesitate to say it, but arguably even more important, because at the heart of fairy tales is transformation. At the beginning of the fairy tale, the hero or the heroine is facing a seemingly impossible situation, and the whole of that story is to show us that you can win through seemingly impossible situations, and you almost always have to do it with the help of kindly mice or a wise old woman in the woods or some other being that is going to help you. Never, ever in a fairy tale get to do it alone. It's always a community effort. So these are really important values and ideas, I think.
That's very interesting. While you're talking about the hero, you and I have both written about the importance of us moving on from the hero archetype, the sort of go get it, smash it, be victorious, and the importance now in at least in the West anyway, where we've very much adopted that archetype for a very long time, the importance of us finding a post-heroic archetype. I wonder if this would be the moment to talk a little bit about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, this was an idea that I began working with probably about a decade ago when I first began writing my first nonfiction book, If Women Rose Rooted, which was really trying to look at the mythology of these islands, of Britain and Ireland, and what they might have to tell us about being a woman, some of the things that we have been talking about. And, as a psychologist and someone who'd worked with myth and story for a long time, clearly I had come across Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. And I have to say, before I go criticizing Campbell, that I think he had many, many wonderful traits. I think he was a great scholar in many, many ways. But I think the hero's journey was a thing for its time. And he was writing about the hero's journey in 1949 onwards. We've changed a lot in those times. And I think that this heroic archetype, it seemed to me when I was writing If Women Rose Rooted, that not only did that very heroic, individualistic, kind of swashbuckling, action-oriented, linear archetype have anything to say about other ways of being in the world, like women's ways of being in the world and other people's ways of being in the world, but also it had well past its time, because I think it is potentially damaging. I think it puts us right into a very individualistic frame of mind, a frame of mind in which we are focused on dominating the world rather than kind of becoming a part of it, in which, the hero is exceptional rather than just your average Joe or anyone like us. And all of these ways of kind of privileging certain ways of being in the world seem to me to be very, very outdated. So I started to work with what I at the time came to call the post-heroic journey, after another scholar, Alan Cheenan, I think had used that phrase first, and really looking back at some of the old myths and fairy tales, including some of those that Campbell had categorized as heroic, but which I know from my own scholarship in the myths of these islands were not at all heroic. But looking back at those old stories and actually seeing in them values that actually weren't heroic at all. It wasn't about individualism. It was about community. It wasn't about taking more, more, more. It was knowing when to stop and when just to take enough. And all of these ideas, I think, are in the old stories. And what we've done is we've kind of only seen them in one particular light, because that's the cultural mythology we live in. We live in them in a world that tells us to be a hero is the greatest thing. Back in the day, it wasn't actually. It was just one way of being in the world. So I think it's not that I don't think the hero's journey has value. I think there are times in our lives probably where we are living a hero's journey, women included. Early adulthood, when we're out there, we're trying to build something, we're externally focused. But I think it has its day as we move into elderhood. And I think it has its day as our culture tries to move into, a different stage of life.
Thank you. So something you write a lot about, which you just touched on, is the other world and the imaginal world. And I wonder if you can say something about those, perhaps especially in terms of the culture of the British Isles and Ireland, where they're not just in the realm of the imagination. They sort of live in a like a parallel reality. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, so all of our stories, and in fact, throughout Europe, stories are all threaded through with concepts of the other world. But the ones that I know best are, again, stories from Britain and from Ireland. And the other world is critically important in those stories, because it is kind of presented as the place where the life and the nourishment of this world, this physical world, comes from. So you couldn't have a physical world without the other world. It would be dead. The other world is what animates it, if you like, and also provides it with a kind of moral compass. And in these traditions, the other world is not a place that you go to. It's kind of, you can see it as the other side of a coin. You can see it as slipping through a veil. You can see it as switching a mode of perception, so that you can catch glimpses of the other world, which is completely entangled with this one. For example, in what we call in our traditions thin places, which tend to be boundary places, edgelands, the side of a riverbank, the seashore, that kind of thing, or at certain times of the year, which are believed to be more porous, like Samhain, which we now call Halloween, the old Celtic festival, which runs generally at the end of October. And there is a lovely old story, just to illustrate what I mean by this, is a lovely old story from Ireland about a guy called Bran, who, to cut a very long story short, hops into a little round boat called a coracle and sets off across the sea to find the Isle of Women, because he's been invited there by a beautiful otherworldly woman that he saw once upon a time. And as he's crossing the sea in this coracle, out of the waves rises up this Manannán mac Lia, who is the Irish, well, he's often called the god of the sea. Let's just keep it simple and say that's what he is. Manannán mac Lia comes out of the waves and says to Bran effectively, hey, you think you're in a boat, don't you? You think you're sailing across the sea, when I can tell you that from my perspective, you're riding a chariot pulled by golden horses across the beautiful flower-filled plains of Mugmel. And so it's just, but they were in the same place. But Manannán mac Lia, who was one of the deities, was seeing one thing. Bran was seeing another. Bran was riding through the other world, even though he was on a coracle on the sea. So there is this sense, literally, of the worlds overlapping. But the power and the moral force of the other world was always associated with women. It was always women who came out of the other world and told the heroes basically what to do, to fix whatever problem there was in the world. And they were the ones who represented the land and insisted on balance between people and the land, and therefore the other world that was entangled with it.
There's a little hint of danger there, isn't there? Also, like the fairy folk were not to be messed with. They were to be respected because they were forced to be reckoned with.
Yeah, indeed. And, in this tradition, the other world is not like the Greek underworld. It's not a place of the dead. It's a place of the ever living. And the inhabitants of the other world were, characters that we would think of as deities or other supernatural beings, animals, and so on. And although it was a place, it was characterized as a place of beauty, and a place, which was very rich, and full of harmony, it also had its monstrous side. So in lots of Irish stories, there are all kinds of monsters that come out of the other world and, generally speaking, create havoc and lay waste to the countryside. So it had a bit of everything, and you had to treat everything with respect. Yeah, absolutely.
A pre-Christian morality, in fact, where you don't have that split between good and evil.
Indeed, yeah.
So I'd love to ask you to tell us a story that's working in you at the moment, a story that's inspiring you at the moment, and explain a little about what it is about that story that you think is guiding you right now.
Yeah, that's a difficult one, because I work with a lot of stories all the time. That's kind of my job, both in writing and in teaching. At the moment, the next book I'm working on with a colleague is called Wise Women, and it's going to be published by Virago Press next year in the UK, and hopefully at some point shortly afterwards in America. And what it is, it's kind of a follow-on from my book Hagitude, which was looking at the archetypes of old women in European myths and fairy tales. And what we're doing is we're collecting all of the myths and fairy tales that we can find which have powerful old women characters in it. And there is one story in there particularly which has stayed with me since we identified it. It's actually probably a story that relates more to kind of midlife and the midlife transition than it is to elderhood. But it is, in brief, it is a Siberian story about a woman and a man who've been married a long time, and it's not going well. And one day she looks at him and she sees somebody that she doesn't know, somebody who's almost monstrous. And so she thinks, okay, I'm off. And she leaves him kind of just like that. She just sees something that she hadn't seen before, and that was her cue to leave. So again, to cut a long story short, at some point as she's leaving the village, this great big giant comes up to her and carries her off to his cave at the top of a mountain, and just kind of dumps her there and leaves her there. And of course, she's distraught. She doesn't know where she is. She doesn't know what to do. And she hears a voice saying, look up, look up. And she looks up and she finds a shelf, and on the shelf is a bird skin, and she tries the bird skin on, but it doesn't fit. So she starts crying again. And then she hears the voice say, look up. And she looks up, and this time she finds on another shelf a fox skin. So she puts the fox skin around her and it fits. And she thinks, well, this is very fine. I'm going to be warm now. And it somehow, the fact that it fits her and she's warm gives her the courage to escape. So she finds her way out of the cave, goes back down the mountain. And as she's going down the mountain, she keeps imagining that she can see something behind her. And by the time she gets to the bottom of the mountain, she realizes that what she can see behind her is a foxtail, and that she is turning into a fox. She goes home, she goes back to her own village. That's her instinct. And she sees her father's tent. This is Siberia. And she tries to go into the tent to say to her father, here I am, I'm safe, everything's fine. And she can't. That every time she tries to go through the tent, it's as if there's a force field there, and she's pushed back. And so she turns around, she looks at her foxtail, and she wanders off into the sunset. And, I've told it very quickly here, not in the beautiful language that you'll find hopefully in our retelling in the book, which is very, very much longer. We wouldn't have time for it today. But I love that story because I think it tells us something about the nature of what happens to us in midlife, particularly in the run up to the menopause or during the period of the menopause. That sense that a new story has to begin, that we've ended one story and a new story has to begin. And once that new story has begun, if we've kind of done the story properly, if we've let the story do its magic on us, we can't go back to what we were before. We've changed fundamentally. And the particular thing that I love about the woman's transformation in this story is that she's transformed into a wild creature.
Mm-hmm.
So it is showing us that one of the things, I believe, anyways, is my interpretation of it, one of the things we need to do in midlife is really to connect with that wild nature, to become fox or to become wolf or to become crow or whatever it is that draws us and that seems to provide what we need at the time. And, there are many, many things that I could say about that story, but I think something about it is very poignant, that sense of passing through a kind of barrier, which, although it enables us to conceive of a wonderful, transformed new story ahead and all kinds of new things to be, nevertheless, there's that poignancy for what we've left behind and a little bit of grief as well. And I think a lot of people who talk about transitions from the first half of life to the second half of life present it as like, it's all great. I know there's a little bit of pain through menopause, but it's all going to be great. And, ultimately it is going to be great if we give ourselves over to it. But there needs to be time for grieving and for loss and for that transition to really work its magic. So yeah, that's a story, as I've been thinking about midlife, particularly, and doing some writing about it, that really has resonated with me.
That's a fantastic story, especially for me. The piece about the wildness really resonates. Makes me wonder how many people on this call or in the audience watching this also have a little bit of wildness that they've tried to get rid of. They've tried to domesticate themselves, and I'm just thinking that wildness often manifests in things we've done that we feel ashamed about or bad about, that we were made wrong for, that kind of follow us like the tail, that we have to sort of integrate and reclaim.
Yeah, I think, again, it's the cultural narrative, the cultural mythology tells us that wild women are bad girls, that's not, that we have to be nice, that we have to be good, that we have to be quiet, that we have to be seen but not heard, ideally. And that's still out there today. It was like that when I was young, and it's still like that for young women and others today. And I think that sense of the difficulty that a lot of women had, and I had a hugely difficult time of it, trying to come to terms with that wild nature and to see it as a benefit, not as a loss of control, but just to see it as an ability to to kind of slip under the skin of the world in a different way, and to find genuine kinship with other than humans. to find a sense of belonging in the world that isn't dependent on human company. That's a very great gift. You're never alone with a crow. Just there's always somebody to talk to out there in some way of being out there. And yeah, we've lost it. And stories like this, I think, leave a kind of trail of breadcrumbs so that we can find our way back to some of those ways of being that we've been forced to repress.
Yeah, I mean, as a clinician, I work with people of all genders, but a lot of people have that kind of dissonance with their own body now, especially women and girls, or women identified people, where there's a difficulty in inhabiting your own skin, because it does feel too wild, too uncontrolled, too furry, too hairy, too smelly, too fat, too thin. So it's a very poignant story, I think.
Yeah, and it's typical of many European stories which are about shapeshifters, and particularly shapeshifting women. So I took in one of my recent fiction books, Foxfire Wolfskin and Other Stories of Shapeshifting Women, I took some of those stories and kind of, put a bit of a contemporary spin on them, but really staying to the heart of the story, which tell us that, again, the plethora of stories out there, the number of stories out there all throughout Europe, and for clarity, I only work in my own kind of native traditions, tell us that there was a time when women, and there are stories of male shapeshifters too, but my work is predominantly with women. These stories of women who are profoundly connected to the natural world in a way that is beneficial, that isn't a sin or that isn't a curse. And an interesting thing that in the stories that we have in Europe, where it's the male character that has been turned into an animal, it's always a curse. Always, always a curse. Whereas for women in these stories, it's kind of part of their natural way of being. They naturally are half fox. They naturally are selkies, half seal. And it's not seen as a curse. It's just seen as the way the feminine kind of manifest itself in the world, which is interesting, isn't it?
That's very interesting. That's fascinating. So let's shift to the culture now. And I wonder if you could explain a little bit about how reconnecting with these old stories can help us as a culture to restore some of what we've lost in terms of that wildness and that connection with land, probably since the Enlightenment and certainly since the Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to go back to the post-heroic issue again, because they teach us old values to live by, which are just as relevant today. For example, rather than witter on, I'll just give you a couple of examples from the stories. There's a wonderful old story in Ireland about the Glass Gavelin, which is translated, which is basically the cow of plenty. And there are lots of stories throughout Britain which are similar to this story, variants of this story. And basically it's about a magical cow, an otherworldly cow who has milk for anybody who wants it. And she wanders around the land, and if anybody's in need of a pail of milk, then she'll fill their pail or whatever vessel they bring to her. That's what she does. Until one day, a wicked person comes along with a whole bunch of buckets and a single sieve and milks the cow through the sieve into bucket after bucket after bucket. And because the cow can't feel the bucket getting full, she doesn't, of course, know that the buckets are filled, that somebody has taken more than one. But when she turns around, because she's tired all of a sudden, and she sees this, she just vanishes, says, that's it. I'm off. Not doing this anymore. She vanishes and she's never seen again in the world. So this is typical of a kind of story that tells us not to take too much. This cultural mythology of progress, of more, every generation must have more than the generation before, otherwise we're failing, is what's causing the world effectively, to run out of nourishment, to run out of stuff. And the old stories kind of knew that way back, way before it really happened, that we must live in balance and harmony. The other kind of story that always interests me, a lot of people put forward the old Grail legends as heroic myths. There's this wonderful swashbuckling knight who battles his way to the Grail, and achieves the Grail. And if you look at the stories of the old stories properly and you understand the context that they are set in, that's not what's happening at all. Parsifal For example, in Wolfram von Eschenberg's version of the Grail story, Parzival does not attain the Grail because he's chopped a bunch of heads off or slain dragons or done any of the kind of heroic knightly things. He attains the Grail because finally, after failing it the first time, finally he meets the wounded Fisher King and simply says to him, "What ails thee?" That compassionate question is what wins Parzival the Grail. It's nothing to do with bravery and individualism and heroism. Absolutely not. He has a lot of battles, but they're kind of by the by. And the old stories were post-heroic, except they were pre-heroic, I suppose. And the reason why I think that it's so important to go back to them is we find a sense of, not just a sense of how to be in the world, but a sense of lineage, a sense that we were like that once, and therefore we can be it again. We haven't lost it for very long. I think for most of human history, we've lived pretty much in balance and in harmony with the natural world. And it's only the past couple of centuries, really, that we've began to completely ruin it and to mess up.
Yes, and of course the we there
yeah.
is the global north, really, isn't it? It's not everybody that we.
Yes, but increasingly, unfortunately, our values are spreading throughout the world. It's kind of a contamination. So it isn't just the global north anymore, doing this. But of course, we are the ones that set those that set those new values loose in the world, a bit like Pandora's box. So yeah, the old stories, I think, give us just give us confidence that we weren't always like that. There's a very negative narrative about humanity out there in the world, and yet we are capable of absolute atrocities. Clearly, there is no question about it. We are capable of very bad things, but if we continue to paint ourselves as wholly negative, then that's what we're going to become. And I like to go back to these old stories where we see a lot of beauty, where we see a richness, but we see different values and different ways of living. That tells us again that this is just an aberration. This is just now. This isn't who we have been for most of our history. I don't believe so anyway.
That's super inspiring. So your earlier books you have a lot of stories, you have women's stories, but your last book, Hagitude, is specifically about women aging. And I wonder if you'd say something about elderhood, aging, facing mortality, and how that is something we sorely need as a culture.
Yeah, well, we don't do it, do we, really? I don't think we do face it very well. I don't think really in most places we're comfortable talking about it. I mean, certainly in the UK up until recently, nobody really talked about menopause. In some parts of America, as far as I can tell, you still don't. It's just one of those taboo subjects. It's a bit grubby. It's just something that nice people don't talk about. And death is another conversation that we can't have. We act as if we're never going to die. Other people might be, but not us. And I think the death thing is important as well as the aging thing, because if we can't accept the inevitability of death, and if we can't find a way to befriend it, then we're always going to want to cling to youth, and we're never going to do aging properly. We're never going to allow ourselves to go through the entirety of the human journey, to grow old and to encounter the gifts that we find as we grow older. And for me, in spite of many, many difficulties like everybody has, menopause was an utterly transformative period. It was really terrible in lots of ways, but what it ushered in was just a kind of wonderful freedom and a way of being in the world that really suited me. And we're not taught to see menopause as the beginning of a possibility. We're taught to see menopause as the beginning of the end. It's ushering in a period of decline. And I don't think that's true at all. And so I wanted in Hagitude, what I did was to go back, as I've mentioned previously, to go back to the old stories again, because I do believe that they're a great source of wisdom, and to see what kind of old women were in those stories. Now, we don't hear a lot about them, because old women are very rarely protagonists of the stories. They appear in the stories, and in actual fact, in many of the stories, they are the ones who are pulling the strings and running the show and setting the hero or the heroine off in the right direction with the right gifts, playing critically important roles, but they're rarely the protagonists. And so the research project that I did actually found that there were lots of old women in European folklore and mythology. They all they played very different roles. There wasn't just like one kind of old women. There were all kinds of different archetypes that were represented by old women. So we have the old women who are mentors of the young. Fairy godmother, is the kind of the classic one, but there are many, many more. Don't have time to go into all of them. We have old women who are tricksters and truth tellers, who disrupt the culture when it needs disrupting, who tell the truth about what's happening when no one else can. We have old women who are initiators and testers of the young. We have old women, think the Fates and the Norns, who are literally weaving the cosmos into being. We have old women who are other kinds of creatrixes. So we have a whole plethora, that's only some of them, not all of them. We have a whole plethora of different ways of being an elder, which are important gifts to bring. And just because they're in myths and folklore, I think doesn't mean that they're not relevant to us. And so what I try to do in the book is give some kind of more contemporary examples of what this might look like. But it's only really by finding inspiration for what we want to become as we grow older that we're going to be able to become it, and therefore give the many gifts that elder women have to the world.
That's beautiful. As an old woman myself, I appreciate that message. So where are men in all of this? How can these stories also inspire them?
Yeah, as I said earlier on, I feel this real compulsion to stick to my own stories. So I don't work with the stories of other cultures because, just as people have misinterpreted Celtic mythology, I might misinterpret their mythology. I wouldn't know the context. I wouldn't be part of it. I wouldn't know the language. And so I stick to my own to my own lands. And, I am a woman. I'm not a man. I don't know what it is to live as a man. And therefore, I don't really feel that I have the right to tell men's stories or to tell men how they should be. I get very, very cross when men tell women's stories and tell me how I should be, because they haven't got the lived experience. And I think lived embodied experience is everything, when it comes to stories that work for us. So it is interesting that a lot of men do actually follow my work, even though it's not exclusively women's stories that I'm interested in. Things like the Postheroic journey, as I've said, are absolutely relevant to everybody. But a lot of men do follow the work, and they are interested nevertheless to know, what women see their roles being, because they haven't done a particularly good job of carving it out for themselves, they tell me. And I think there are things that women can offer that perhaps men wouldn't necessarily see as relevant stories. In the context of the hero's journey, for example, I would always point men to different archetypes. Like the hero is not the only archetype that there is for men to be. What about the smith, who's a wonderful, magical character in all of the old stories? Smiths are mythic. They're magical. What about the magician? Warriors that are not heroes can be very interesting characters. There are all kinds of really interesting masculine archetypes out there. And the only thing that I ever say is go and find the ones that nobody is, really kind of writing about, and make them, inhabit them, make them your own. And I'd long one day for someone to write the equivalent of Hagitude for men, because I think there are so many interesting archetypes out there. But it's not going to be me, because, I don't know what it is to live that experience.
Mm-hmm. I read recently that the UN Human Rights Commission has announced that over 1.2% of the world's population has been forced to leave their homes, which is a staggering number. And it includes over 32.5 million refugees. And I raise that point because I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of people are no longer on their ancestral land, either because it was taken from them by settler colonizers or because they were forced off their land. And of course, with global warming, we have a lot of people on the move. And I'm wondering how this work about the land can be relevant to people who are not on the land in which the bones of their ancestors are buried, to quote Martin Shaw. So can myth migrate, or can we inhabit new land and the myths of new land?
I think it's a bit of a mishmash. It is a really big subject, and one that I've written about quite a lot, but I'll try to keep it short. I believe that knowing our ancestral stories teaches us ways of finding new stories or different stories or related stories in the land where we live now. And, a lot of people who follow my work are Americans, and I've lived myself in America. So I come across this question all the time. There are two kinds of stories of the land. Okay, so if you can think, just bear with me and think of it this way alongside me. There are the existing stories of the land, stories that have already been told about the land. In America, it's kind of tricky if you're a white, come from kind of white settler stock, if I can put it that way, because the existing stories of the land belong to a completely different culture. They're not yours. And so you can't inhabit them. You can respect them, you can learn them, you can want to know them, but they're not yours. But then there are the stories of the land that we make, that we create as we inhabit the land. And these are ongoing forever. And it's really important, I believe, to understand that the stories of the land, the stories of the relationship between people and the land, don't stop with anybody at any time. They're constantly ongoing. So, and I also think that it's a responsibility that we have in any land that we inhabit, that we find a way to create relationship with it. And creating relationship means creating stories. So, for example, the Kalia is a creature of Ireland and Scotland, wild, windy, cold, wet, lashing weather, rocks. You're not going to find the Kalia in the Californian desert, but you'll find an old woman archetype there for sure. And knowing the stories of the Kalia might perhaps help you find it. Well, if I can just tell you a little story, which if anybody has followed my work before, they'll have heard me speak about, in which case I apologize, but it is quite a good one, I think, to illustrate this. So years ago, I lived on the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, and the whole land was steeped in stories of the Kalia, pre-existing, absolutely there. Place names, folklore, she was in that land. She made and shaped that land. And also, there was a series of kind of reclining, rocks and mountaintops that seemed to have the shape of a reclining woman. So a woman lying on her back, you could see the mound of the breast, you could see a slight swell of the belly, you could sometimes see an arm and some hair. Throughout Scotland, named after the Kalia, obviously, it looked like an old woman in the landscape. We had one outside our house, and it was a place that was very wild and very remote, and not many people lived there. And I didn't have anybody to talk to except the dogs and my husband, and that wasn't enough. And so I would walk out on the land and I would talk to that rock. I would talk to that old Kalia, and I would tell her all of my problems. And I kind of felt that I was really part of that mythology and part of that folklore. It mattered to me. It informed who I was. Then we moved to probably the only part of Ireland that did not have any stories of the Kalia, in the northwest of Ireland, in Donegal. And there were no Kalia stories there. There were no place names named after the Kalia. There were no Kalia rocks. I didn't know what to do with myself. I had become so attached and embedded in that mythology that I really did feel curiously cast adrift. Again, to cut a long story short, we lived by a river. At the back of our house was a heronry. Every morning at dawn, I'd walk with the dogs. One morning, we startled a heron in the middle of a river, and she flew off and she shrieked, and I thought to myself, goodness me, that sounds for all the world like an old hag. And then I had it. The old stories of Ireland represent heron as old women. They shapeshift into old women. And all of a sudden, I went out into the bogs, I went on my walk. By the time I got back, I had been completely overtaken by this character that I called Old Crane Woman, who was half woman and half heron. And she shapeshifted somewhere between the two. And sometimes at night she would look like an old woman with kind of gangly legs and arms, and sometimes she would look like a heron. And she had a very distinctive voice. And by the time I got back, I had started to write stories about Old Crane Woman. She was the archetypal old woman in that land, heron, in an act of kind of co-creation between me and the land. Anyone can do that. Anyone can do that. You don't have to go out making it up. You just have to be in the land and open yourself, and these archetypes happen to you. That's, I think, how archetypes work. They're not inside our heads. We don't make them up. Like the Sufis did, I believe that there is an imaginal world, our other world, where the archetypes live, the stories live, out of which synchronicities come. And if we are lucky and open and receptive, they happen to us. And so I think that anybody in any lands can find stories can find archetypes to engage with, can build relationship. And sometimes, as the stories of the Kalia did for me, the ancestral stories can help you find a way into that because you already own those stories. They're already a part of you.
That's lovely. And it segues to my next question, which is you wrote a whole book called Reenchantment. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about the approach that you call reenchantment.
Yeah, that was the enchanted life. And
oh, sorry. Yes.
no,
Enchanted
no,
life.
that's fine. But it was a project of reenchantment for sure. And I suppose I was a bit irritated by people kind of, dissing the word enchantment as magical thinking. It's just ridiculous. You need to grow up and stop talking about these ridiculous terms and ideas. And I didn't see enchantment as magical thinking. I saw enchantment as relationship. And I wonder, could I just read you a paragraph from the book that explains exactly what I meant by enchantment, which would be easier than me waffling away here?
That would be great.
So this is from the introduction. I believe that enchantment is an attitude of mind which can be cultivated, a way of approaching the world which anyone can learn to adopt. The enchanted life is possible for everybody. Because enchantment, by my definition, has nothing to do with fantasy or escapism or magical thinking. It's founded on a vivid sense of belongingness to a rich and many-layered world, a profound and wholehearted participation in the adventure of life. The enchanted life is one which is intuitive, embraces wonder, and fully engages the creative imagination. But it is also deeply embodied, ecological, grounded in place and community. It flourishes on work that has heart and meaning. It respects the instinctive knowledge and playfulness of children. It understands the myths we live by, thrives on poetry, song, and dance. It loves the folkloric, the handcrafted, the practice of traditional skills. It respects wild things, recognizes the wisdom of the crow, seeks out the medicine of plants. It rummages and roots on the wild edges, but comes home to an enchanted home and garden. It is engaged with the small, the local, the ethical. Enchanted living is slow living. Ultimately, to live an enchanted life is to pick up the pieces of our bruised and battered psyches and to offer them the nourishment they long for. It is to be challenged, to be awakened, to be gripped and shaken to the core by the extraordinary which lies at the heart of the ordinary. Above all, to live an enchanted life is to fall in love with the world all over again. So that's kind of, it's pretty all-encompassing, but that's what enchantment means to me.
I'm just thinking that kind of attitude can be so dismissed, and you alluded to that before as sort of the lacy overlay of life. But in fact, it's really fundamental.
Yeah, it is. And I think, to be enchanted is really to have your imagination engaged. And one of the reasons why stories work is because they capture our imagination. So as a psychologist, I've used all kinds of different therapies. Cognitive behavioral therapy is very wonderful for certain particular disorders, but nobody's going to be excited by it. Nobody's going to want to do it. They're just desperate to get over it. Whereas if you can tell somebody a story and show them their place in the story and help them to reimagine how that character in that story might find the way out of the mess that they're in, you've got them. Always, always, always without fail. So that sense of having the imagination captured so that you can see possibility in the face of the world's many challenges, I think to me is at the heart of enchantment. That really is what it is about. It's all about the imagination.
I bet you're putting me in mind of Rob Hopkins, who started the Transition Town movement, and whose latest book is all about the fact that we've lost our capacity to imagine. People actually find it easier to imagine the end of the world due to ecological disaster than they do to imagine a world that they would prefer to live in and a life that they would prefer to have. So his work has become about trying to facilitate that kind of imagining.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So putting all this together, what are some ways that we can practice radically tuning into the land, the other world, the imaginal, to re-enchant our lives, perhaps for wisdom or guidance?
Well, that's a big question. A couple of ways that I can suggest. Mad as it sounds, talk to everything. If you act as if the world is alive and animate and capable of being in relationship with you, then it will be. That sounds a bit like magical thinking, I suppose, but it isn't. It is the case. I talk to everything out there and in here, everything. It's not an affectation. It's just a way of being in the world that I learned when I didn't have anybody else to talk to. I talk to crows all the time, and sometimes they look at me and I think, I know what a crow is in my mythology, but what am I in the mythology of a crow? There's a reciprocity that develops and a sense of a mysterious, remarkable being, that ubiquitous, tricksterish black bird that I don't understand and probably doesn't understand me, although certainly better than I understand him, but is looking at me, and we're kind of in this space together and imagining things about each other. I do believe that animals have imagination. The idea that it's just human is ridiculous. Just like the idea that only humans have emotion. I mean, goodness me. Anyway, that's another story. So I think to talk to things as if they were alive and listening to you, and chances are you find that they are in some way. I talk to trees. And it's not just man-made things. It's not just what we think of as natural things. It's what we could describe as man-made things, which in the most fundamental atomic level are not man-made at all. There was a wonderful book written by a Canadian professor of literature called Sean Kane at the University of Trent University in Toronto. I think he is still there. Wrote a book many moons ago called The Wisdom of the Myth Tellers, and he talks about an Australian architect whose name escapes me walking through the streets of downtown Sydney in Australia with an Aboriginal elder and bemoaning the fact that there's all this dead concrete in the city. And the Aboriginal elder looks at him and says, look, to my people, even concrete has a dreaming. Even concrete has a dream of becoming, because just because it's constructed of different bits of this and that doesn't mean that those bits of this and that aren't actually alive and that something isn't alive in the concrete. And I thought to myself, gosh, if we could just see, the big buildings in our cities in that way, wouldn't it be a different world? Wouldn't it be a different thing to live in a city? So treating everything with respect as if it's alive and wants to be in relationship with you, I think, is absolutely the most fundamental, life-changing thing that anybody can do.
So really what you're talking about is a sort of contemporary animism.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess so. And, clearly our ancestors were animists. Indigenous people around the world and traditional cultures today are animist, and for very good reason. Not just because they're mad or foolish, but because the world wants to be in relationship with us. And, I have a feeling, a belief, if you like, that we have a responsibility to be in relationship with the world. If the old Greek, briefly, the old Greek idea of the world soul, the anima mundi, which fills everything. Everything is imbued with the anima mundi in the old Greek tradition that Plato wrote about. The sense that if you don't engage with it, it's almost as if it fades, that we're kind of keeping the spirit of the soul of the world alive by engaging with it, by being in relationship with it, by acknowledging it, just as we keep people alive and engaged and inspirited by being in relationship with them and talking to them and making them feel as if they belong. And I do think that it's a responsibility that we have to be out there and to see the world as alive. And that really is the most radical shift, I think. And I think you get that shift by acting as if it were true, and then it becomes true because it reveals itself to you. The world reveals itself to you.
This is a very poignant conversation, given that right now the water off Florida is 100 degrees Fahrenheit and we're having unprecedented heat waves everywhere. Crops are failing, people are on the move. To actually tune into the aliveness of the world, where in some ways it feels like the biosphere is dying, is a strong medicine.
Yeah. And again, I think a lot of the old traditions would have it that the soul of the world never dies, It doesn't die. It might have fadings, or it might have times where it struggles, but life is always in a process of becoming. And I'm not saying that in any way to comfort us for the mess that we have made of the world, but it will become something else, and the part that we play in that, or how we relate to it, or whether it makes us comfortable, is a different thing entirely. I don't think that the anima mundi itself ever really dies, and I think we have to keep a hold on that, and to feel that sense of responsibility, whilst recognizing that the world isn't a child that we can shape to our will. The world has its own process of becoming, and not that we shouldn't feel responsibility for the mess that we make, but like life does go on, and I think it's important that we feel that that is okay, and that we witness the dying of the things that are dying, but that we act as if we have hope for anything that might come in the future. Sorry, I don't know whether that was very lucid in the end, but
No, I think it was. And you're making me think that a lot of the stories that you've described do involve going into a space, a liminal space, a space between worlds where you don't know what's going to happen. And you have to keep your wits about you, tune into the other beings around you and listen to what they're saying, because there is no linear path. And so they're a good guide in these times.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have some fascinating questions coming in, and I kind of want to shift to those. Mm-hmm. They're meaty and they're fascinating. So are you up for questions from our audience?
Absolutely. Looking forward to them.
Great. And I'm encouraging the audience to keep the questions coming. So the first one says, can we use European myths and fairy tales to work with women of color who have faced oppression by white culture? Very much an American question, I think, although it's also relevant to our audience in Europe and Britain.
Gosh, I don't know that that's what the stories are about. I mean, I think it's very clear that throughout history there have been examples of oppression and colonization and slavery throughout cultures, including not just the North. That has happened. But the stories really aren't about that, and because they reflect the world, the predominant world that people were living in at the time. Folklore, for example, is very much about the small, the small rural, the small town, the small village, and doesn't really look at these big pictures. And the mythology was more about describing kind of cosmology, I suppose, rather than the kind of sociocultural things that you're talking about. So at the moment, I can't off the top of my head see a way that the stories that I'm aware of in the European tradition would be relevant to that. There may well be in other cultures, but I can't think of any at the moment. Rachael, is that something you can contribute to?
Well, yeah, I mean, I like to consider the folk tales, myths, and fairy tales of all kinds of different cultures and help people to find the relevant streams that are relevant to them from their tradition. I'm in mind of someone who wrote to me about a terrible time she was going through that had lasted for 7 days of intense grieving, until she realized that in her Persian tradition, when something dies, you have 7 days of grieving. And suddenly it made sense to her that for 7 days she had been completely racked, and that guided her through. It gave her a connection into her own mythology, with which she could ride this wave that was going through her life. So I think that these cultural streams of stories and mythology are so rich that there's so much to link people to from their own tradition.
Okay, I think I may possibly have misunderstood the question then, because you've answered a different one from the one that I was imagining. I mean, I think if the questioner is asking, are these stories from the European tradition relevant to people from other cultures who come in? Of course they are, because they're the stories of the place where they have landed. And certainly with folklore, a little bit less with mythology, but certainly with folklore, what we see time and time again is that the same motifs, the same characters, the same themes, the same concerns are reflected in stories from different cultures. Again, it's the classic archetypal thing. We understand the basis, but the characters will wear different clothes, will eat different food, quite literally, but the basics will be there. So I don't think that the stories of different cultures are actually very different at their heart. And again, I don't think they're in the business of excluding. I think they're there for everybody. So apologies if I misunderstood that question.
No, I think we were just addressing different facets of the question, actually. The next question says, how have you felt empowered and seen your life change through the inspiration of mythology?
Oh gosh, in all ways, I think, in all possible ways. Certainly, I really began to focus on my own native mythology when I had spent between the years of, well, up until I was about 40, so it would have been about 33 to 40. So through the classic, a good chunk of the classic midlife decade, I was in America. And although I had focused on, I'd loved fairy tales and been steeped in mythology ever since I was a child, I hadn't really thought of it as something that was relevant to life. I'd really seen it as great stories and fascinating history and, interesting philosophy. And it was only being in a different place where I could not relate, clearly to the stories of the land. I didn't know how to find my own then. I just felt very strongly that this was not my place, that there were no stories for me here. And although I had intended to stay forever, I eventually came back to Britain, understanding that therefore, if that was something that was lacking in another place, I had to really delve into, the stories of my land and my tradition. And as I mentioned earlier, what I found in those stories was ways of being a woman that seemed to make sense to me, because as a young woman, I hadn't been very comfortable in a woman's body. I didn't know what it was to be a woman. I was the classic person who followed the hero's journey, who followed the kind of, what back in the day was perceived to be what a man did. The overt, extraneous, extroverted, action-oriented, linear way of being in the world, and suffered for it. But I didn't know any other way. I hadn't had good female role models during the first half of my life. So I think what this very strong and fascinating, powerful and gentle women of British and Irish mythology did for me was to show me that there were ways of being a woman and mattering, that there were ways of what has traditionally been called, feminine qualities or women's wisdom, the more intuitive, relating, emotional qualities that, of course, all of us have, but that are associated with women. That there were ways of expressing those qualities which had been frowned on for all of my life, that actually were valuable and felt good. So everything changed for me. Mythology has done everything, I think, for me.
We have a question that fits onto the end of that, which is, someone says, are there stories in your British tradition that do not fit the female-male gender binary? And to limit our search to that seems like a limitation of an otherwise inspiring and important project.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, I think what you have to understand, certainly in folklore, is that they do very much reflect the culture of the times and the way the culture presented itself at the time. So if you have folklore that comes from a culture that did very much see gender in binaries, then that's what's going to be reflected in the stories. And if you go to cultures where that was less the case, then you find that reflected in the stories too. European culture, for better or worse, during those days was very binary. At the point where the oral stories from the oral tradition were being written down, I would say there is one big exception, and that is in stories of tricksters, where we're looking at the archetype of trickster. And in European stories, trickster isn't always an animal like it is, say, in many of the Native American traditions. So we have all kinds of different tricksters. And the nature of the trickster archetype at its heart is as disruptor. Trickster comes in and shakes things up. Sometimes it's gentle and sometimes it's not. But trickster in the stories fulfills a necessary function to just come in when something is stagnant or ridiculous, and to show people how ridiculous it is and how it needs to be changed. Tricksters often disrupt gender norms in the old stories. So they'll just transition from male to female, sometimes to animal, just quite naturally and quite automatically. And I would say, you often find tricksters doing that. And I think that's the only real example that I have come across in the folklore, certainly, of non-binary ways of being in the world, which is a pity, for sure. And that's why I believe it is incredibly important that we don't allow the old stories to stay static. Always remember that the point of folklore in the oral tradition was it changed with the times. The stories changed as the culture changed and as what people needed changed and what people were becoming changed. The problem with folklore is as soon as we started to write it down in books, it was as if it was carved in stone and it couldn't change anymore. If those stories were still in the oral tradition, we would have non-binary characters, protagonists all over the place. Clearly that's how the world is now. The stories should change, but we don't have a strong oral tradition. And it's a pity. We should keep working with these stories so that they become relevant to the way that we need the world to be today.
Yes, you're putting me in mind of Nicola Griffith's new book, Spear, where she retells the Parsifal myth, and Parsifal is a young queer woman. And it's a great retelling. So I would say to that, I think it was Janet Henderson who asked that question. Janet, do look up Nicola Griffith's book, Spear. You will love it. It's very inspiring.
Sounds like I love it too. I'll make a note of it. I've not come across that one.
I think she's about to win an award for it. So I think you'll love it. And she's from Hull. So she's
right.
Yeah.
Just down the road.
We have a question from Florentia. As a screenwriter, I've been very interested in story structures that help us move away from the ubiquitous 3-act hero's journey. Have you identified different structures that you could share with us that support different worldviews?
That's not something that I have actually focused on. To me, when I look at the critiques of the hero's journey that I personally have focused on, not the only ones that there are, but the ones that I have focused on, it's been less about narrative structure and more about, I guess, theme and execution. So more in the sense of, okay, what are the questions that we are asking here? Who are the characters that we are going to focus on? I think that 3 or 7 act narrative structure, depending on the particular model that you're using, is actually, I think it does make sense, beyond obviously the postmodern novel or a more experimental kinds of fiction or film for that matter. I think for most of us, we intuitively understand that kind of structure. I'm not saying therefore that we shouldn't mess with it and we shouldn't shift it, but just to say that that's not really what my focus has been on. It's been much more on the questions that we're asking and the characters that we are promoting as important ways of being in the world in our culture.
Chris Dawley asks, given threats of progress such as technology, commodification, globalization, etc., to Indigenous languages and traditions, what are more ways that the old stories can be told, shared, and learned from to continue passing on our full diversity of collective archetypal human wisdom? He suggests groups, forums, and events.
Yeah, I think this is a really, really important thing. And it's one of the reasons why my colleague Angharad and I are collecting together the stories of older women in British and in European folklore, because those stories have never been collected and they're hidden, they're lost in the great morass of folktale collections that exist all around Europe. And what we want to do is to collect them together so that they can not only be read but be told, so that women can tell them to their children, can tell them to their to their daughters, so that they know that life does not end at 40, that there are great adventures ahead and other journeys to be embarked upon. So I think part of the trick here is to collect the stories that we think are important, that we think reflect the values that we want to promote in the world today, and just to tell them. I think sometimes it's as simple as telling them, not just telling them to kids, but telling them amongst each other. Back in the day in Ireland, we lived in a place where there were lots of poets and there were lots of musicians and there were lots of writers, and if you went out for a meal or you went to dinner or you had a drink in the evening, so somebody would always say a song or say a poem or sing a song or tell a story. And that way they were part of daily lives. In the Gaeltacht of Ireland, the Irish-speaking areas, the Kalia, the telling of long old saga stories around the fire is still very much alive and thriving. I think whatever we can do to make these stories told and to collect them together so that we have them as resources, because it's been a very, very long piece of work for us to dig out all of the relevant stories about old women, for example.
Yeah, and one of the things I find inspiring about Angharad's work is this work that she and her colleagues do to sort of go back and excavate the little shreds of the Welsh tradition, the Brythonic tradition, and sort of grow them forward by extrapolating from what's left, because of course it was almost destroyed by English colonization, and bringing those fragments and trying to reimagine how they would have come forward if we had the whole record, which I find.
Yeah, but I think we have to do that in England too, because England is a culture. There is a Brythonic tradition in England, just as there was an old Brythonic tradition in Wales. There is an interesting and very compatible Anglo-Saxon culture when that particular group of people became prominent in England. There are Roman threads. We are a culture here in this country that has all kinds of different and very fascinating threads. And they are still many of them. They are still many of them there and embedded in the landscape. It's just that in England, particularly, people seem to have taken in the idea that there are not. And I find it really kind of fascinating. And that's one of the things that I am absolutely focused on at the moment, is excavating those English stories, the stories from the land here in the north where I grew up and where I live now, which are old, and fascinating in all of the ways that we've been discussing, around the Irish stories, and just making people aware again that we all have this lineage. Some of us more than others in terms of what's left, the fragments of text and so on, but we all have it. And
so in fact, we can all go digging for the shreds of our tradition that have been lost or elided or occluded or hidden or otherwise not passed on.
Absolutely. And certainly in the context of the old woman stories, I mean, there are English stories of old women, which are absolutely fantastic, really interesting, sparky, funny old woman stories that we just haven't seen in any other tradition. So every country has its kind of own special way of contributing to something that is important in the world today. And, this is not nationalistic nonsense. This is our lineage. This is the story of who we were once upon a time. And if it informs the story of the changing people and culture that we are becoming with the input of other cultures and the intermingling of stories from other cultures, then to me, that's just a fascinating way that the world continues to grow and transform.
Someone says, are there flower stories or flowering tree myths?
Flowers, actually, the folklore about flowers, but flower stories, I suppose that it's not probably what you're looking for, but the most well-known one in Britain would be the story of Blodeuwedd, which is a Welsh story about a woman who was created out of flowers, specifically out of meadowsweet and oak, and I've forgotten the third one, but it's late. And she was created as a woman for a man who had been cursed by his mother that he should never have a human life. So they created her out of flowers. Now, not surprisingly, she was created out of flowers. She had a different set of values. She had a different set of morals from the human values, and it didn't end well for her. She was transformed. Well, did it end well for her? She was transformed ultimately into an owl for trying to murder the husband who had created her for his use and benefit. And she was transformed into an owl, and that was supposed to be a punishment. But gosh, I don't know if you've ever seen an owl. Is that a punishment? Such a beautiful creature. So that's the only one that I can think of. There are probably more in the Greek tradition, but I'm not quite so familiar with all the specifics of that.
That story is ricocheting through my mind. Someone says, Alexandra says, how do you see land archetypes in the USA, given very different regional mythologies? And would you say we should look to the regional stories of local land, or would we look to the archetypes that are common throughout each? This is kind of an eternal question, isn't it? Whether we get local or whether we look for the common threads.
I think we always have to start in the place where our feet are planted. For me, anyway, that's a place to start. A lot of it to me comes also, and again, just briefly, because I know we're coming to a close, a lot of this comes from the nature of the landscape. The stories come from the nature of the landscape. So geology is really important. Okay. If you live on granite, it's very different from if you live on chalk. The land is different. The spirit of the land is different. The possibilities are different. Granite is hard, enduring, metamorphic, created out of incredibly high temperatures, volcanic eruptions. Chalk is kind of quiet and white and made of little sea creatures, dead bodies, and what have you, and it has a different sense to it. So in some ways, I think the possible archetypes come out of the land, not just the landscape features like rivers and lakes and what have you, but the actual geology. And I want to just give you one little story about that, if I may. And it's a Californian story because years ago, when I was living in America, I could never quite understand California. I loved California. It was very wonderful. It was very beautiful, but I just couldn't make any sense of it. And I don't mean the people or the culture. I just mean the land. I didn't know what it was. And I didn't know why I didn't know what it was or why I even wanted to know what it was. And then I went through my various midlife transformations, got a bit more focused on mythology, on archetypes, on geology, went back, came back actually about just before the pandemic in about 2019, and a person that I think many of you will know, Craig Chalquist, who was at CIIS for a time, at that point was assistant provost or something of Pacifica Graduate Institute. And I have Craig's permission to tell this story, by the way. We were having a conversation about place and archetypes and all of the rest of it. And he said to me something that I find very, very interesting, which was he used to go in the hot times of the summer to sleep up in the mountains above Santa Barbara, and that he would often, just sleep without a tent or without a sleeping bag or whatever because it was so hot. And one night he had this really, really vivid dream about some giant serpent that was just, working its way through the mountains underneath him. Very vivid, a bit like one of Jung's big dreams, not just your average common and garden midnight madness. And so he was curious about this, and he went down to, and I'm so sorry, I've forgotten the name of the tribe, the Native American peoples in that part of the world, the coastal.
Not the Coast Miwok.
Yes.
Oh,
yes. No, or some beginning with CH. Anyway, whatever it was, they have a relationship with Pacifica. And he went to those people and he said, look, do you guys know anything about a serpent? And they just laughed and said, don't be ridiculous. Of course we do. That guy's been there forever. But what was very, very clear was that they were very comfortable with the fact that although, the serpent had been in their mythology forever, the fact that the serpent had talked to Craig was perfectly normal, or had appeared in Craig's dream or Craig's imagination was perfectly normal, because again, as I said earlier, that's what happens. The stories of the land continue. But I think what I'm trying clumsily to say is that the existing stories of the land, the existing mythology, give you an idea of the archetypes that are in the land. What is important is that you don't appropriate somebody else's relationship with those archetypes, with that serpent. What goes on between the serpent and that particular Native American community was for them. But that doesn't stop you having a relationship with the archetypes of that land. So I think the old stories, the existing stories, inform possibilities, and the ancestral stories that you carry with you kind of help you refine them a little bit. When I think of serpent, I think of dragon. We have a lot of dragon energy in this part of the world, and it's very, very similar in nature. So if I were to encounter a serpent in a particular place like that, I would probably overlay it with what my imagination tells me about dragon energy, and I would imagine it to be kind of similar.
It's the Chumash people, by the way.
Chumash, thank you so much. That's it.
Yeah, Coast Miwok is more in my region. Yeah. Well, especially when that serpent visits you in a dream, it clearly has something to tell you.
It's not going to be denied.
Mm-hmm. So our last question from Denise: how do we maintain and nourish the intrinsic identity of a woman, especially beyond motherhood, if that's present in her life, and when reaching old age, which isn't seen as a heroic trait as it is in the case of the male archetype?
I don't know. I don't know what the intrinsic identity of a woman means. What I would say is that the cataclysmic hormonal shifts that occur for us in menopause, whenever that may happen, some people clearly have very much earlier menopauses for medical reasons than other people do. Whenever that happens for us, I think that fundamentally changes the nature of what it is to be a woman. The possibilities that open up are different from the possibilities that were open to us when we were fertile, capable of becoming pregnant, and kind of focused on the monthly cycles of menstruation. The fact that drains away from us, that goes away from us, opens up the space to be creative and attached to different cycles, to be creative in a different way, and attached to different cycles and seasons of our lives. There's a wonderful statement in a book, the name of which escapes me, from a Native American writer from the Lakota tradition, who basically said when women stop bleeding in menopause, the power of the blood stays inside. You're not putting it out into the world. The power of the blood stays inside. So the ability to be creative stays inside, and different types of creative energy are born. And I think that the essence of creativity, which is part of pretty much every female archetype, stays with us, but it shifts when it's not driven by this particular aspect of our biology. And the archetypes that I talk about in Hagitude, the archetypes of old women that come from European myth and folklore, give us different ways of putting that creative energy out into the world. So we've stopped, birthing children, stopped birthing, if we choose to do that. There are different ways of birthing things into the world. I don't know whether that answers your question, but I was struggling to be sure that I understood what you meant by the intrinsic identity of a woman. I hope that does it.
Well, Sharon, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been really wonderful to have it with you.
It has. I've really, really enjoyed it. And thank you so much for hosting it.
You're very welcome. Well, we'll say goodbye to you. You can finally go to bed, because I know it's late for you. Thank you for staying up so late to talk to us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.